Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Stella Levantesi. I'm a climate journalist, and I'm the author of the book I Bugiardi del Clima, out in Italy with La Terza, which investigates climate change denial history and obstruction tactics to climate action. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Mann, one of the world's leading climate scientists and distinguished professor of atmospheric science and the director of the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University in the United States. He's also the author of The New Climate War, out in Italy with Edizioni Ambiente, which is a book that shows how fossil fuel companies have waged a 30-year campaign to deflect blame and responsibility on the climate crisis, which will be our main focus and topic for today. Hello, Dr. Mann. Thank you for being here with us today.
Hi, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
So as some of you may know, this week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as the IPCC, which is the main UN body responsible for publishing scientific assessment reports on climate change, published a third part of their latest report, which was on mitigation. And it had already published the second part of the report in February, which stated that any further delay in global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Now, the IPCC has released its first assessment report in 1990, and climate science and climate scientists have known about the risks of climate change and of burning fossil fuels for decades now, and have been sounding the alarm since then. So before we get into anything specific, Dr. Mann, I'd like to ask you, what happened? Why has action on climate been so slow, even though climate science has been sounding the alarm for such a long time? And what kind of forces came into play? Can you take us through that a little bit?
Sure thing. So, we have been really sounding the alarm now for the better part of 3 decades. And we have the scientific community have met quite a bit of resistance from the fossil fuel industry that has found the message of the science, the fact that climate change is real, it's human caused, it's already a crisis, and it is a result of our continued reliance on fossil fuels that is, of course, inconvenient to the fossil fuel industry. And so they have fought tooth and nail against efforts to act on climate. They have attacked the science. They have attacked the scientists. And I learned that the hard way back in the late 1990s when we published the so-called hockey stick graph, which really demonstrated the unprecedented nature of the warming that is taking place today. The shape of the curve, it looks like what we call a hockey stick in the United States, the sharp upturned blade, the dramatic warming of the past century that has no precedent as far back as we could go, 1,000 years. And that represented an inconvenient fact to fossil fuel interests, and they engaged in efforts to discredit the hockey stick and to discredit me. And if we had acted decades ago when we knew a problem, we knew we had a problem, it would have been fairly easy to gently lower our carbon emissions, to gradually wean ourselves off fossil fuels. What decades of inaction due to the disinformation campaign waged by the fossil fuel industry and bad petrostate actors like Russia, what that has bought us now is a much more challenging task. We need to reduce carbon emissions now by 50% within the next decade if we are to avert ever more catastrophic climate change impacts. And the latest IPCC report, as you allude to, the third in the sequence of 3 reports that make up the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, makes it fairly clear that there is still a path forward, but it's extremely narrow. We have very little time left. And we can thank the fossil fuel industry and conservative media outlets and politicians who have acted as advocates for them rather than as advocates for us. We can thank them for this predicament.
And the fossil fuel industry, as you say in your book, has waged this disinformation campaign. And climate denial strategies have evolved through the years. They have changed. They have adapted to different sociopolitical contexts. In your book, you talk about the InActivists. Can you tell us who they are and if you consider inactivism to be another form of climate denial or delay?
Yeah, thanks, Stella. It's a great question. Sort of what are the tactics that they are using today? It's very difficult to deny climate change anymore. Those of you who live in Italy, if you live in Venice and you're dealing now with the flooding from sea level rise, if you have witnessed the extreme floods and wildfires that have played out across Europe, including Italy in recent years, here in the North America, Australia, where I did a sabbatical 2 years ago. Um, the forces of inaction, and I call them the inactivists, can no longer dispute the basic evidence that climate change is happening because people can see it with their own two eyes. But that doesn't mean they've given up this fight to keep us addicted to fossil fuels. They've just shifted in their tactics away from denial, but towards all of these other tactics, each of which also in English begin with D, division, getting climate advocates fighting with each other online on social media using trolls and bots to get climate advocates fighting with each other so they don't represent a united front demanding action. So that's division. Then there is deflection, deflecting attention away from the needed systemic changes, policies, carbon pricing, subsidies for renewable energy, blocking new fossil fuel infrastructure, systemic changes that are necessary but will hurt their profits. So they have instead tried to deflect attention away from those needed systemic changes to individual behavior, as if it's all on us to change our diet, to change how we travel, that it's just a matter of us changing our behavior. And make no mistake, we should do everything we can to lower our carbon footprint and our environmental impact. But that alone isn't going to achieve the reductions we need. We need systemic changes, and they fought that. And deflection is the tactic where they just want to deflect the conversation towards that and away from the need for policy change. Then there is delay, promises of future technology, carbon capture and sequestration, geoengineering, all of these supposed solutions that they promise we can implement in the future that are being used by polluters as an excuse to continue with business as usual now. And then finally, there is doom or despair mongering, because ironically, if they can convince us that there's no problem, that it's too late to do anything about the problem, that potentially leads us down the same path of inaction as outright denial. And they don't care about the path we take, they just care about the destination. They want people disengaged, they want them on the sidelines, not on the front lines of the battle. And one way to do that is to convince people that there's just nothing we can do anymore. So we have to be aware of these very insidious tactics. They're more subtle, but they're every bit as much a threat to the action that we need today.
We'll get back to the individual responsibility narrative later on because I do want to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah.
But the other day I was talking to Jamie Henn. Jamie Henn is the director of Fossil Free Media, which is a nonprofit media lab which supports the movement to end fossil fuels in the US. And he was telling me something that I think is very relevant to the conversation. He was saying one of the most powerful arguments the fossil fuel industry adopts today is to make us think that fossil fuels are inescapable, that to make us feel like fossil fuels are indispensable to our lives, to power our economies, to create jobs. And I'm interested in knowing your perspective on this. Has this been an effective argument? What do you think? And can we live without fossil fuels?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's sort of a corollary of that, which is known as energy poverty, and this has been used by inactivists who feign concern about the plight of the poor, and that the best thing we can do is to provide them cheap energy, and they call this energy poverty. So in essence, they've tried to co-opt the concern among often progressives, not necessarily political conservatives, but progressives, people who would normally be supportive of climate action, who would be demanding climate action. But you can convince them that it's going to hurt the poor And it's a way to, once again, to co-opt the movement. Again, that division that I was talking about. And the reality is that, the developing countries, the global south, the poorest among us are the most impacted by climate change. And they have the least adaptive capacity, the least resilience to deal with the consequences. So the worst thing for them would be for us to double down in fossil fuels. It makes much more sense for them to leapfrog past this dangerous, uh, you know, fossil fuel stage and develop a clean energy economy. And that's what we should be helping them do. So it is part of this larger narrative, Stella, that you're describing here, this idea that fossil fuels are necessary for us to thrive as a civilization, necessary to help poor people out of poverty. It's a really disingenuous and cynical argument because, of course, the worst thing we can possibly do for humanity and for all living things is to continue on this fossil fuel path that we're on. As I like to say, there is no economy on a dead planet. And for all the arguments about how climate action will supposedly cost too much and hurt the economy, it's climate inaction that's going to hurt the economy. We need to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And as if we didn't need another reminder of that, of why, even if you ignore the climate crisis, which is the greatest long-term crisis we face, the crisis that's playing out right now in Europe, Russia's aggression toward Ukraine, is only possible because we've built up this petrostate, this authoritarian petrostate, through our reliance on their oil and their gas. We created this monster, and now we're reaping what we've sown. So it's yet another reminder of why we need to get off fossil fuels as quickly as we can.
Yeah, and of course, it's also a tactic that's being, exploited right now because of the war. That we absolutely need fossil fuels. So even though we get off, Russian gas, we still need some other country's gas.
Right.
But there are other problems on the communicative level as well. The climate deniers and delayers have relied and still rely upon what we call the media echo chamber to promote their message and strategies. And in the US and other countries, this is usually right-wing media, conservative media, which overlaps ideologically and politically with fossil fuel interests. But here in Italy, there's still a big problem with false equivalence in what we would call progressive media as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of climate deniers, delayers, and activists are being invited on mainstream media channels, especially broadcast shows, to share their views, making it seem as though the scientific debate on the climate crisis is still ongoing, which of course only confuses the public and creates disinformation.
Yeah.
And this, it seems like it's not too much of a problem in the US anymore. So I'd like to know, first of all, if you can briefly explain why false equivalence is problematic, and then how would you overcome this issue? How do you think we can overcome this issue here?
And there still is some of that here in the United States, but we've largely moved on, in part just because of the devastating consequences, the impacts that we've seen play out. It just isn't credible to deny that it's happening. So, as we were discussing there, the tactics have become somewhat more subtle. And most of there is still false balance, but it's usually not a debate over the science. It's a debate over, whether renewable energy is the solution, or whether we can rely on carbon sequestration. And there still is false equivalence. Those who are still basically advocating a policy of inaction are often still put on the stage with those representing the overwhelming consensus that we need to do something about the problem. And I think it in part relates to just the nature of media. And even, it's not just a problem in the conservative media, as you noted, sort of mainstream or even progressive media, because I think progressives tend to have a sense of fairness, right? That you deserve to have an opportunity to express your opinion. Conservatives don't necessarily believe that. And so ironically, you have progressives often willing to bend over backwards to provide a forum to those advocating positions that really don't have much merit just because of the sense that you have a right to express your view. I think that has played into this problem. And it is a problem because the overwhelming consensus of the world's scientists is that climate change is real, it's human caused, and indeed it now reflects a crisis. That's the message of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the consensus of the world's scientists as represented by these latest reports. And so when you put a climate denier or a climate delayer or somebody simply arguing that it's not a problem, it's not a crisis, we can engineer our way out of it in the future, when you put them up on the stage with somebody representing, again, the overwhelming consensus that we have a crisis and we need immediate action, you're telling the audience that these are two equal views. You're sending the signal that these are two equal views. The overwhelming consensus of the world's scientists and, a representative of some right-wing think tank who's mouthing, conservative talking points. You present the public a diet that consists of equal parts of those two things. What they're going to take away from that is there isn't a consensus here. I don't need to worry about this problem because people are still debating it. And let me know when you've settled the argument. In the meantime, I'm going to focus on, putting bread, food on my table, feeding my family, all these other immediate needs.
So a lot of the climate delayers and inactivist strategies today have to do with solutions. As you were saying before, outright denial is kind of over, thankfully. But yeah, there's this sort of more insidious tactic and strategy. And in your book, you talk about the non-solution solution. Can you tell us what the non-solution solution is and how the strategy works?
Yeah, so the idea here is that the public understands that there's a problem now. And so if you're a fossil fuel interest group, a politician doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry, media outlet, a right-wing media outlet promoting the interests of the fossil fuel industry, again, not only can't you deny climate change, you really have to sound like you're trying to do something about this problem because people are feeling the consequences. And so it's the art of talking the talk while not walking the walk, sounding like you're putting forward a solution when you're really not, using words like innovation and adaptation, resilience. These are code words for inaction that sounds like action. These are empowering sounding words, but in the end, they're typically used by opponents of climate action to kick the can down the road, to imply that we can just adapt to the changes, to the use of the term innovation, that the market will just find some way to solve this problem, including some of these very dangerous prescriptions like geoengineering, interfering with the global climate system in some other way to somehow try to offset the effect of carbon pollution, the warming effect of carbon pollution, shooting particles into the stratosphere, dumping iron into the ocean. What could possibly go wrong if we do these things? The idea that might be the solution. Carbon capture, that we can suck the carbon back out of the atmosphere. It turns out that's really hard to do. There's no evidence we can do it at scale and safely bury all that carbon where it won't escape back into the atmosphere. It's, as we say, much easier to keep the genie in the bottle than to let it out of the bottle and to try to get it back in. And that's essentially what you're doing with carbon capture and sequestration. But mostly these provide talking points to inactivists so they can sound like they're doing something, but in fact, it's empty rhetoric. It's empty rhetoric that is intended to provide a crutch to fossil fuel interests to allow continued business as usual. And so it is pernicious. And we see that very much still in the United States and obviously in Italy and the rest of Europe and around the world.
Yeah, and I think another really big issue is greenwashing. We're sort of most of us familiar with the term. In Italy, it's certainly an enormous problem, both on the side of companies and on a political level as well, with arguments such as, gas is a bridge fuel and it's low carbon and all of that. Um, so can you tell us, you know, explain maybe a little better what greenwashing is, but also help us to recognize greenwashing. How do we know if someone is using, the greenwashing strategy? How do we know
Yeah.
if they've greenwashed their activity or their argument?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. And the short answer would be, you know, don't watch their lips, watch their wallets. Don't take at face value the rhetoric that they're spouting. Look at how they're investing their money. And so greenwash is, just what we were talking about. It's an effort by polluters, by fossil fuel companies, for example, to again talk the talk without walking the walk. Sound like they're actually doing something about the problem. And one of the ways they do that is through their advertising campaigns. If you watch, commercials for the various fossil fuel companies, and here they play regularly on American TV, on the leading news networks, you're bombarded with these advertisements from the fossil fuel industry, and they um, promote this idea that they are prioritizing clean energy. They talk about, the various projects they're supporting that are aimed at producing cleaner, uh, renewable energy. And a lot of their advertising campaign is devoted to this greenwash, this public face that they are part of the solution, that they're really working to do something about the climate crisis. But if you look at their investments in clean energy and renewable energy, they're tiny. So it's clear that their business model is still completely based on the extraction and the selling of fossil fuels. But meanwhile, their advertising strategy would make you think that they're at the very front of the pack, moving forward on meaningful climate solutions. So that's what we mean by greenwash. It's an effort, it's a public relations campaign aimed at making them look like their policies are green, when in fact they're doing very little, if anything, to further the cause of clean renewable energy.
Talking about strategies, you were mentioning before the individual responsibility strategy, which I think is definitely one of the most effective denier inactivist strategies. And it's been a deflection campaign to redirect responsibility for the climate crisis at the individual level. And
Yeah.
we know that what we call the crying Indian ad is sort of the starting point for this strategy. So, Dr. Mann, can you tell us a little bit about it and how has this narrative affected the way that we perceive responsibility on the climate crisis today?
Yeah, thanks. I spent a whole chapter talking about it. It's a really remarkable episode, particularly for me, because I grew up watching this commercial. It aired for the first time the year after the very first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1971. I guess I was 6 years old at that time. And the commercial ran for a couple years, and I remember this advertisement, and it had this Native American. They're called, we use the term Indian. They're not Indian. They're not from India, but that is the term, that was the popular term used to describe Native Americans back in the 1970s. And so it's, this Native American in a full headdress rowing down this river, which has been strewn with bottle and can litter. And it ends with a tear running down his eye. And it drew upon sort of the zeitgeist of the time. There was almost this mythology that surrounded our indigenous people, the Native Americans. There was great power and symbolism in our portrayal of Native Americans, and that was seized upon in this commercial. And it made people like me, we felt empowered by this commercial. Yes, we can It exhorted us to pick up the bottles and cans and to clean up the countryside. And we felt empowered by this commercial, this message that we can, save our environment. Little did we realize it was, and the ad was sponsored by the Ad Council, which is a nonpartisan organization that does public service announcements. But its funders, the funders of that ad, were actually the beverage industry, Coca-Cola, Anheuser-Busch. This was actually a corporate PR campaign hatched on Madison Avenue in New York that was aimed at undercutting efforts to pass bottle bills in states like Massachusetts, where I grew up. They didn't want bottle bills. These would require the return of bottles and cans that would be recycled and processed by the beverage companies. It would hurt their profits. It would clean up this problem at its source. It was a systemic solution to the problem, but they didn't like it because it would hurt their profits. So instead, the Keep America Beautiful campaign, the Crying Indian commercial was part of that, was an effort to deflect attention away from the need for policies, systemic solutions, bottle bills, and instead make it about individual responsibility. And it was very successful. There are only a handful of states that have bottle bills. There's no national bottle bill. And we can thank them for one of the other great environmental crises that we have today, the global plastic pollution crisis. Now, I will point out, by the way, that the Native American wasn't even a Native American. He was an Italian American. And so the subterfuge was there even at the most superficial level, but it went much deeper than that. This was really a very clever PR strategy by industry to prevent systemic solutions to an environmental problem. And the fossil fuel industry has run with it. They've run with that same playbook, and they're using it today to make it all about, once again, individual action rather than the need for policy.
Do you think that this strategy was kind of amplified in good faith even by environmentalists and, certain media platforms trying to, bring forward the environmental cause? But, sometimes I get asked this. So do you think it was amplified in this sense?
Oh, absolutely. There are several environmental organizations that were co-sponsors of this campaign. So they were convinced that this was something worth supporting. They didn't realize at the time what was really going on and how it was being used. And I forget, I think it might have been Environmental Defense or the Sierra Club, but there were a couple prominent environmental organizations in the US that were co-sponsors of this PSA, this public service announcement. And absolutely, they believed that it was furthering their goals of environmental sustainability. They backed out a year or two into the campaign when they realized, like the rest of us, that they'd been fooled.
I get the this question a lot myself, and when I talk about this issue publicly, some people ask me, "What can I do? What can we do at the individual level?" Because the individual responsibility narrative is extremely insidious, and it's a key aspect of the obstruction efforts to climate action. But of course, this doesn't really mean that individual actions or that individual behavior within collective action is inefficient or not important. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, therein lies the conundrum here. That's what makes this so insidious. The basic message is a valid one. We all should do everything we can to decrease our environmental impact and our carbon footprint. And by the way, many of the things that we do, bicycling to work rather than driving or using public transportation, buying more fuel efficient vehicles, a lot of the things that we do there, to further that goal actually make us healthier, save us money. They're sort of no regrets actions. We ought to be doing them anyways. And they make us feel better about ourselves. And they set a good example for other people. So they're good things to do. problem is when this is presented as if it is the entire solution. It's used as a way to distract from the need for policy, for systemic change. And, you know, one of the most important ways to affect policy change is through collective action. That can mean voting for climate advocates, voting out climate delayers and deniers. It can mean demonstrating protests that raise awareness. And I think of the youth climate movement, Greta Thunberg, and youth climate protesters who have really made a real difference in the conversation. So it is really important for us to act as individuals, part of a collective, and collective action is necessary to achieve those policy goals. So it is a complicated sort of, problem to navigate because individual action is important, and individual action ultimately comprises collective action, which is what we need to get the policy changes that we need. So it's all about making sure that we don't allow polluters to convince us that that's all we need to do. Individual action is all we need to do. And here's the bottom line. Many of us will take part in these actions because it's important to us. We know it's the right thing to do. But to achieve the reductions that we need everybody to engage in climate friendly choices, to make climate friendly choices. And that means even people who aren't thinking about climate change, we need them to still make climate friendly choices because the incentive structure is such that they're led to naturally make those choices.
Solutions at the systemic level. So what should, politicians and governments be doing right now to kind of hit those climate targets and decarbonize as soon as possible?
Yeah, I mean, we saw some progress in Glasgow, and the EU has laid out some pretty bold targets. I believe more than 50% reduction in carbon emissions within the next decade. The United States is committed to a 50% reduction in carbon emissions over the next decade. If all the countries of the world make good on their current commitments, it does make a real difference. It brings the warming maybe down below 2 degrees Celsius. And that's assuming, again, that all of the nations of the world actually make good on their commitments. They're not just promises, there are actions behind them to keep those promises. That's still not enough. We've got to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That means we've got to go further. We've got to make greater reductions than the United States and China and India and the EU, and Australia is a real laggard here under their current conservative government, but there may be regime change there in the near future, and there might be a potential, for example, for Australia to make a bolder commitment. So we need to ratchet up those commitments. The commitments that we have on the table at this point aren't enough, and we need to implement those policies. Again, we can't just have policymakers, politicians talking the talk. They need to be walking the walk. So if you're saying that, your country, that we are going to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% within the next decade, and by the way, that's what we need to do globally, 50% reduction within the next decade to stay on that path to keep warming below 1.5 Celsius. If you're making that commitment, making that promise on the world stage, but you're still funding new pipelines, oil and gas pipelines, and coal mines, the International Energy Agency, which has been no cheerleader for renewable energy, they've been very conservative in that regard, but they've come out and they've been very clear that in order to meet those commitments to lower carbon emissions by 50% globally within the next decade, there can be no new fossil fuel infrastructure. We can't be building new oil and gas pipelines and new coal mines. And so politicians who are committing to meeting their obligations but are supporting expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure are not really keeping their promise. And we, again, comes back to us, right? Individual action, collective action, we need to hold them accountable. That's one of the things that the youth climate movement has done, is speak truth to power and hold our policymakers accountable. We need to continue to put pressure on them to keep their obligations, to keep their commitments, and to go further, because we know there's a huge amount of pressure on them coming from the still very powerful fossil fuel industry.
And to this point, one of the things that the IPCC report has kind of made clear is that we must act now and we must decarbonize now. So why is this action so urgent? What do experts mean when they say that we're running out of time, or, it's now or never?
Yeah. So, you can do the math here. As a scientist in this field, I know the math, and it's formidable. We have a small budget left. One of the things we understand now, based on decades of increasingly sophisticated climate modeling, is that there is this quantity that's known as a carbon budget. We can calculate how much carbon there is left to burn if we are to keep the warming of the planet below some particular level. We can calculate the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're already over 1 degree Celsius, arguably closer to 1.2 now. So there isn't a lot of wiggle room. If we're going to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, there can be very little additional warming. And we can calculate what the budget is, how much carbon there is left to burn. And when you do the calculation, it tells us that business as usual for even another decade will cause us to blow past our carbon budget. We will exceed our carbon budget. To stay within that carbon budget, that's where these numbers that you often hear about, we need to reduce carbon emissions by 50% this decade, and we need to bring them down to zero by the middle of the century. If we can do that, we likely, and again, there's uncertainty here. We can't promise even then, but there's a good chance in that scenario we keep the warming of the planet below 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which you really do start to see some of the worst and most irreversible consequences of climate change. So again, coming back to the latest IPCC report, there is a path forward, but it's a narrow path because our carbon budget is shrinking and shrinking. And every year of relative inaction, that budget shrinks even more.
Been involved in a lot of the InActivists attacks personally. You were mentioning your hockey stick graph before, which illustrates a temperature spike in the 20th century after 900 years of stable climate. So what do you feel is the most important thing that you've learned during these years, and about how the denial machine and the InActivist world works?
Yeah, wow, what a great question, and we could talk we could talk for days about that. Having been on the front lines of the battle, and again, I was subject to attacks decades ago because of the iconic hockey stick curve. The forces of inaction, the InActivists, the fossil fuel companies, and conservative media outlets, and the politicians doing their bidding, really set their sights on me, and there was a target on my back. They were looking to take me down as a way of taking down the hockey stick, this very inconvenient graph that really laid bare the the dramatic nature of our impact on the climate and the crisis that is upon us. So, I think one of the things I learned, I was a naive scientist when this all started. And as a scientist, you're sort of trained to believe that if you make a solid argument, the facts and logic are behind you, that wins the day. You just need to present the evidence. And if you make a compelling case, well, then, policymakers will take what you've told them and they'll make policies based on that information. That's not how it works. As a naive scientist, you quickly learn that while those might be the rules in the world of science, those aren't the rules, um, of hardball politics. And in the world of policy and politics, there are going to be individuals and groups and political parties with a vested interest that aren't interested in having an objective, good faith conversation about the problem. their goal is to discredit you and to discredit the science to move forward their political agenda. And of course, sadly, here in the United States, we've seen that play out in such a profound and tragic way over the past couple years, where one of our two parties, the Republican Party, decided early on that the science behind the public health messaging over the pandemic was inconvenient to their political interests. It was inconvenient, for example, to Donald Trump and his election prospects. They needed to somehow dispute that COVID-19 was really a problem. And they ended up going down that path, basically attacking the science behind vaccines, behind mask wearing and social distancing. And as a result, there were hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths in this country due to purely ideologically driven anti-science over this public health crisis. Well, the COVID-19 crisis will be in our rear view mirror, a year or two down the road. We'll largely be past it, but the climate crisis will still be looming there. And more lives will be lost due to climate inaction than will have been lost due to the pandemic. And so we have to recognize that we still face this politically motivated effort to, if not deny the science outright, deny the need to move beyond fossil fuels and to address this crisis in a meaningful way. That's not something you learn as a scientist. You're not trained in politics and realpolitik and all of these other dimensions of the political debate over climate change. But you learn along the way, and I've been on the front lines now for more than 2 decades. And so there have been some hard-won lessons that I've learned. And part of the purpose of my book, of The New Climate War, is to try to share those lessons with other people.
I think it's also an excellent example of how facts are not enough always. And so learning about these strategies and understanding how these mechanisms and dynamics play out is fundamental to understand how to deal with the climate crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it seems like the science on the causes of climate change and its risks is clear and has been clear for a while now. And the fossil fuel companies and its allies have sort of taken a physical problem, climate change, and transformed it into political propaganda.
That's right.
To make it more doubtable, which is also what you were mentioning earlier. So I don't know whether you agree with me here. I think so. But it seems like the problem has really never been science, right? So the
Yeah.
Consequently, the obstacles to climate action today are political and have to do with politics and economics and vested interests and power.
Yeah, I mean, I started out in physics, in theoretical physics, and there are things that we argue for, in theoretical physics, black holes and gravitational waves that sound far more dubious than the science of climate change. They are really tenuous in terms of the evidence that we have for them. They're based largely on theoretical calculations by pointy-headed scientists like myself. And yet there's no public opposition. There are no movements to discredit the existence of black holes or the Big Bang. There's none of that because it doesn't pose the same challenge to a powerful vested interest. It's any time that the findings of science have found themselves on a collision course with powerful special interests, that's when we've seen the sort of contentiousness that we see with the climate crisis. And so you're absolutely right. If it were just about the science, that was settled decades ago. The fact that we're warming the planet and it's having real world impacts that we can see for ourselves, that was settled long ago. And yet the relative lack of inaction can be attributed entirely to politically motivated and profit motivated opposition to the message of the science. And again, as you note, it ties into, the even larger crisis we face now in our public discourse. I'd like to think that the bad faith discourse over climate change decades ago it's now metastasized. It was like this local cancer that has now metastasized to infect our entire body politic, to the point where the United States, one of the two major parties, the Republican Party, deals in traffics in conspiracy theories and nonsense and lies. The truth isn't advantageous to them. It's inconvenient to them. So they just make up their own truth. And that's a scary place to be. As a scientist in particular, I find that very chilling. The great Carl Sagan, who is a hero of mine, passed away some decades ago. Great science communicator, great scientist, foresaw this decades ago. He warned about the path that we were on, and he warned that one day he feared that we would have a society that celebrates ignorance. And that's where we are now.
On that note, no, so it seems like science is not the problem. What about technology? Do we have the technology to kind of deal with this energy transition? There's a lot of misinformation going on about renewables.
Yeah.
So do we have the technology to do this?
Yeah, we absolutely do. I mean, the science here is very clear as well. We have existing technology: wind, solar, geothermal energy, increasingly sophisticated battery and energy storage, efficiency measures that we can take. We have the tools now to solve this problem. As you've already alluded to, the obstacles, they're not scientific, they're not technological. They are entirely political at this point.
I think one takeaway message from all of this is that if there's something that's crucial to understanding the climate crisis, is how much it intersects with every other sphere. So how much it has to do with politics, economics, public health, culture, geopolitics, social justice, right? So really every other sphere that you can think of. And it's not just something that has to do with the environment, right? Which is something that sort of a message that is continuously reiterated, at least here in Italy, in certain media outlets and dimensions. But I think that talking about this issue without underscoring these connections only really reiterates the message that the climate crisis has nothing to do with our lives or our health
Right.
or even our survival, which is absolutely
Right.
not the case, and it's not true.
Yeah.
And yes, the climate crisis contains many other crises, but its solutions, inevitably, as we have seen, cannot be what caused it in the first place.
Right.
So can you tell us, what do you think about this? And if there's also one last message that you'd like to leave with us today before ending this wonderful conversation.
Thanks. No, I've very much enjoyed it. And you used the word social justice, and I would take it one step further: ethics. We often frame this in terms of cold economic cost benefit analysis. That has been very advantageous to the InActivists. The idea that there are costs of taking action, and that's dubious in the first place, because when they invest money in a new pipeline, somehow that's an investment. But when it's clean energy, it's a cost. So the whole cost benefit framework that's been advocated by economists, for example, is questionable, and it has actually played into the delayism. But when we make it about economics or science or politics and policy, then again we're playing into the hands of the InActivists, because more than anything else, it is about justice, climate justice, social justice, and it's about ethics. Our ethical obligation not to destroy this planet for future generations, for our children and grandchildren. We've been given this amazing gift, and we are, in a sense, as the Bible preaches, we are stewards. We are not owners of this planet. We are stewards. And we need to show that stewardship. And we've somehow forgotten that, you know, that that value has been lost, in much of the discussion about the climate crisis. I think that the youth climate movement has finally recentered this conversation where it needed to be, about the ethics of what we are doing to the planet. And, if you're going to ask me, am I, despite all of the challenges, and we've talked about so many of them here today, do I have any optimism? The answer is I do have optimism. And much of it comes from the activism that we see from younger folks today. It's inspiring to me, and it gives me hope that despite the monumental nature of this challenge, we will rise to the occasion.
That's a very optimistic and beautiful message. I hope so too. I'm told that because of COVID restriction and reasons, we can't have any questions from the public, so I'm really sorry about that. But it has been a real pleasure having you with us today, Dr. Mann, and thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me as well. And thank you. Thanks to all of you. This is our moment. We can make this happen. Thanks, everybody.
Have a great rest of the festival.